History doesn't always happen in the places you'd expect. It happens in the small towns, the back rooms, the forgotten corners, in the lives of people whose names never made it into the textbooks. People who shaped the world anyway, from towns you've probably never heard of, the unsung, the overlooked. But they were there, and what they did mattered. This is One Shot at History. Sit back, pour yourself something, and let's get into it.
What could possibly happen in Wisconsin that rises to the level of suspense, mystery, government cover-up? Fair questions. This is, after all, the state best known for cheese, the Green Bay Packers, and the birthplace of the ice cream sundae. Not exactly the stuff of the Cold War. But Hollywood has always had a soft spot for the Midwest when things gets unusual. Remember Starman, 1984? Jeff Bridges, aka Alien Lifeform, arrives as a goodwill ambassador to Earth. Naturally, the U.S. government shoots his spaceship down. He crashes into Chemagnon Bay, Wisconsin, the lone alien occupant looking like a floating ball of energy. Finds the home of recently widowed Jenny Hayden, and the government scrambles to quiet to make the whole thing disappear. Doesn't want the public to know. Doesn't want questions asked. Just wants that the strange visitor is gone before anyone notices. Or how about the Lake House? Set partly in the quiet, unassuming lakeshore country of Illinois and Wisconsin, a tranquil rom-com where, of course, something is impossible is happening right under everyone's noses, and people experience it can barely explain it themselves. A signal that moves through time, messages nobody was supposed to receive. Or how about 2012? Great movie, where scientists discover that something enormous, something world-altering, and the end of civilization is happening deep underground. And the people in charge know about it long before the rest of us. And of course, they just don't want to tell us about it. Later on, it's revealed that after the shifting of the Earth's crust, the South Pole ends up becoming located in Wisconsin. I bring these up not because aliens landed up in Clam Lake, Wisconsin. They did not, as far as I know. I bring them up because the story I'm about to tell you hits every single one of those notes. A secret project built in the remote Wisconsin forest. A signal that travels underground, through bedrock, through the ocean floor to reach someone who can't be reached any other way. A government that very much hoped the public wouldn't notice. And when people did notice, they were not pleased. The only difference between this story and those movies, this one actually happened. Now, I know what you're thinking. W.T.F. What the Wisconsin? What could possibly happen in Wisconsin that involves secret military experiments, Cold War paranoia, and enough weirdness to make a person stop mid-bratwurst and say, hold on, what? Fair question. In this state, better known for our cheeses, our supper clubs and Packers, and people who will absolutely drive through a blizzard just to make sure they don't miss a good fish fry. It is not, at first glance, the kind of place where you'd expect the U.S. Navy to build a secret communication system for nuclear submarines. And yet, that's exactly what happened. Because during the Cold War, when American submarines slipped deep underwater, under the North Pole, in the deep oceans, carrying enough firepower to end civilization, the Navy ran into a problem. It was a pretty big one. Once those submarines disappeared beneath the surface, they were almost impossible to reach. You couldn't just pick up a radio and call them. The ocean doesn't care how important your national defense strategy is. So after years of research, somebody in Washington looked at the laws of physics, looked at a map of the United States, and somehow arrived at this conclusion. We need Wisconsin, not Florida, not California, not Area 51, not some remote island in the Pacific. We need Wisconsin. They wanted the forests. They wanted the bedrock. And they wanted the peace and quiet. And for a while, they wanted the whole state. We're talking buried cable, giant power demands, national protests, courtroom fights, sabotage in the woods, and one of the strangest communication systems ever built. And because apparently this story was not weird enough already, at one point the Pentagon also ended up spending $13,000 on a bull. Yeah, you heard me right, a bull named Sylvester, who was tied to research connected to the project. A detail that became such an embarrassment it was mocked into the press as a perfect example of defense spending that had gone off the rails. Yes, there is a Cold War Wisconsin military story that includes both nuclear submarines and an expensive government bull. I'm your host, Carl Reineman, and today we're heading into the North Woods to tell the story of the Wisconsin Test Facility, or as history has very generously allowed us to abbreviate it, W.T.F. And honestly, no acronym has ever worked harder. To understand why the Navy got interested in Wisconsin, you have to understand what made Cold War submarines so important. By the early 1960s, nuclear submarines had become one of the most important pieces of America's deterrent strategy. They could vanish beneath the ocean, stay hidden for long periods, and carry ballistic missiles that made them the ultimate second strike weapon. In plain English, if the Soviet Union launched first, submarines were supposed to survive long enough to answer back with an attack of their own. And that only works if you can still communicate with them. And that was the problem. Regular radio signals don't travel through seawater. Once a submarine was deep enough, it became extremely hard to reach without forcing it to come closer to the surface, which of course is exactly what you do not want a strategic nuclear submarine doing if the whole point is to stay hidden. So the Navy went hunting for a signal that could penetrate the ocean. That led them to something called ELF, extremely low frequency radio. ELF signals operate at frequencies so low that they almost don't feel like radio at all. They move slowly. They carry very little information, but they can travel extraordinary distances and penetrate seawater much better than ordinary radio waves. Now that's the good news. The bad news was that transmitting ELF is absurdly difficult. The wavelengths are enormous, thousands of miles long, which meant if you wanted to send one of these signals, you didn't just need an antenna tower. You needed something almost comically large, not a structure. You needed a landscape. That kind of setup where the ground itself becomes part of the machine. And that's how Wisconsin entered the chat. Now, let's talk about Project Sanguine. The Navy's early answer to this problem was a proposal called Project Sanguine. Now, that is a wonderfully upbeat name for a plan that basically said, what if we wired up a huge chunk of Wisconsin and hoped nobody noticed and nobody panicked? The idea emerged from years of classified research and then finally surfaced in public at the end of the 1960s. And when people learned what the Navy had in mind, their reaction was immediate. Because Project Sanguine wasn't some little fenced-in laboratory, it was huge. The original concept called for roughly 6,000 miles of buried cable spread out over about 22,500 miles of Wisconsin, along with 100 underground power facilities. The entire thing was meant to create an ELF system resilient enough to keep transmitting even under catastrophic conditions, including nuclear war. So let's look at that in perspective. That's 40% of the entire state of Wisconsin.
I'm sorry, what?
With buried cables underground, ready to become the world's largest and only ELF transmitter. This wasn't just ambitious. It was the kind of plan that makes local residents look at one another and ask whether anyone in Washington has ever actually met a farmer. People worried about land use, environmental effects, electrical currents, property rights, and the simple fact that the federal government seemed to think it could quietly repurpose a massive part of the state for military communications. Environmental groups objected. Anti-war activists objected. Property owners objected. Politicians who felt blindsided objected. In a rare burst of civic unity, all kinds of people who normally disagreed with each other looked at the project and said, in some version or another, absolutely not. And to be fair, you can understand why. It's one thing to support the national defense in the abstract, but it's a whole other thing to entirely find out your woods, your field, or your hunting land might become part of the world's largest submarine messaging system. The Navy eventually backed away from the full sanguine vision, but they did not give up ELF. They just did what governments often do when a giant plan becomes politically toxic. They scaled it down and they changed the packaging, and they moved quietly into the woods. That smaller version took shape near Clam Lake in Ashland County, deep in the Chemagawin National Forest. And if you're trying to hide a very strange Cold War communications experiment, this is not a bad place to do it. Clam Lake is beautiful country. Forests, lakes, long, quiet roads, and the kind of silence that makes you think twice before slamming a car door. In 1968, the Navy established what became known as W.T.F, the Wisconsin Test Facility. Officially, that name is perfectly bland. Unofficially, it feels like destiny had a sense of humor. Because once locals and critics grasped what this place was for, WTF stopped sounding like an acronym and started sounding like a reaction. The location wasn't random. Northern Wisconsin sits on an ancient granite bedrock known as part of the Laurentian Shield. For ELF transmission, that geology mattered because low conductivity rock help force currents deeper into the earth, effectively making the system work over a larger volume of ground. In other words, the bedrock was doing part of the engineering. The site itself was unusual, but at a glance not dramatic. It used long antenna lines stretching through the forest on wooden poles, designed to resemble ordinary utility infrastructures. Some of these poles even carried fake transformers to help the whole thing blend into the rural life of Wisconsin. That detail is one of my favorite, because it tells you everything about the mood of the project. This was not a giant science fiction dome glowing in the trees. This was a weird military machine dressed up like a boring power line, hoping everybody would just keep driving by, looking at the deer and the forest and the trees. Now here's where the story turns from secretive to genuinely bizarre. The Clam Lake system operated at 76 hertz. That is incredibly low. Low enough that the signal feels less like a modern communication and more like the earth is just clearing its throat. The goal was not to send long messages. Nobody was down there reading detailed updates, weather reports, or cheerful notes from headquarters. ELF was for tiny coded signals. Just enough information to tell a submarine commander, essentially, you need to come up higher, surface, and receive a real message another way. And it was painfully slow. A single 3-letter code group could take 15 minutes to transmit, and a message of only a dozen letters could take close to 2 hours. Good thing they didn't have podcasts back in the 1960s. So no, the Navy was not texting submarines. This was more like tapping on the world's largest basement wall and waiting for someone under the ocean on the other side of the earth to tap back by obeying orders. And then there was the efficiency problem, or more accurately, the almost hilarious lack of efficiency. The Clam Lake facility, working with its companion site in Republic, Michigan, used about 2.6 megawatts of input power, but the actual ELF radiation output was only around 8 watts. Yeah, 8 watts. That kind of number really deserves a pause and for us to think. The United States military built an elaborate, politically controversial, electrically hungry communication network to send a signal with roughly the output of a small light bulb that you would use as a nightlight in a hallway. And somehow, Incredibly, it worked. In May 1982, the first ELF transmission from Clam Lake was successfully received by a submarine submerged in the Atlantic off the Florida coast at a depth of about 400 feet. Now let's think about that for a second. A signal generated in the forests of northern Wisconsin traveled through bedrock and across vast distances to reach a hidden submarine underwater in the Atlantic. It's one of those moments where science sounds ridiculous right up until it succeeds. Now, just when this story seems like it has settled into a neat little rhythm of geology, secrecy, military over-engineering, don't look over here, nothing's happening. Oh, by the way, in walks the bull. In 1981, criticism of defense spending latched on to one of the oddest details associated with broader ELF controversy. The Department of Defense had spent at least $13,000 plus its daily care and feeding, plus the research costs, for a fertility experiment tied to the concerns about electromagnetic fields in livestock. Yes, they got a bull. Bull named Sylvester. And if that sounds like a punchline, it is, because it eventually became one. A UPI report at the time quoted critics and experts describing the episode as essentially a whole lot of money spent to confirm what common sense probably could have told everyone for much less. And honestly, you could picture the local conversations up in Clam Lake. The Navy says, we need to run wires through the forest so we can whisper coded messages to submarines under the Atlantic. Wisconsin says, no. And then somewhere in the middle of that argument, taxpayers learned the government also bought a very expensive bull. At that point, even if you had not been paying attention before, you were absolutely paying attention now. So yes, buried inside of this already strange Cold War story is a side plot involving one government-funded bovine who may have done more than any activist to make the whole enterprise sound ridiculous. Every great Wisconsin story should have at least one unforgettable animal in it, I think. And this one just happened to be on the Pentagon's tab. The Wisconsin test facility may have been a smaller than Project Sanguine was originally intended, but it did not escape controversy. Not even close. The same coalitions that fought the larger plan kept pressure on the scaled-down version. Environmentalists, anti-war organizers, and local opponents continue to challenge the project in public meetings and in courts and in the press. Some opponents took things even further. On 5 separate occasions, protesters cut down transmission line poles in the forest, physically knocking out parts of the system. And that's an astonishing detail. Not because sabotage was unheard of during the Cold War, because it happened in northern Wisconsin, in the middle of the woods, against a communication system most Americans had never even heard of. It sounds like the plot of an art house thriller nobody would finance or greenlight. But it happened. Congress got involved too. By the 1990s, Senator Russ Feingold pushed measures aimed at ending the program, arguing the Cold War had ended and the strategic case for ELF no longer justified the controversy and the obscene expenses. For the Navy, for its part, kept insisting ELF still served a unique purpose. It argued that no other systems could so reliably reach a submarine at depth while remaining resistant to jamming and usable under extreme conditions. And that was the core tension all along. To critics, the project looked outdated, wasteful, and intrusive. To defenders, it was a rare last-ditch line of communication in the darkest scenario imaginable. Now let's talk about the end of those whispers in the woods. In 2004, the Navy shut down Project ELF. By then, the Cold War had been over for years. Newer technologies had matured, and the strategic landscape had changed enough that maintaining the Wisconsin and Michigan facilities no longer made sense. After decades of transmission, the poles went quiet. The site near Clam Lake, born out of a Cold War urgency, public resistance, and some truly strange engineering, was decommissioned. And just like that, one of the oddest military systems ever hidden in the Midwest faded back into the trees. For decades, A facility in northern Wisconsin had been whispering coded signals to nuclear submarines deep beneath the ocean. Slowly, awkwardly, at an enormous cost and effort, and with terrible efficiency. And with one unforgettable side story involving a government bull that made the whole thing sound even more unbelievable. If somebody had pitched this as a movie script, a studio executive would probably have said, "It's fun, but maybe lose the bull. Nobody's going to believe that part. Sounds like bullshit to me." And yet the bull stays, because history, unlike Hollywood, does not care whether a subplot seems too weird. So here's what we're left with. The Navy needed to talk to submarines that could not be reached by ordinary radio. The physics pointed to an extremely low-frequency communication system. The geology pointed to Wisconsin. And the politics pointed to a fight. What followed was one of the strangest Cold War stories in the American Midwest. A plan to use Earth itself as part of an antenna. A secretive test facility in the Chamaguen Forest. A signal so low it took 15 minutes to send 3 letters. Activists literally cutting down poles in the woods. And somewhere along the way, an expensive Pentagon bull wandering into the public imagination like it belonged there. What the f***? The Wisconsin test facility was real. It was secretive, and it was controversial. It was technologically impressive in a deeply ridiculous way. And it might have been the most Wisconsin-flavored Cold War story ever told. But of course, this happened here. Of course, it involved our bedrock, local resistance, government overreach, and a bull named Sylvester. This has been One Shot at History. I'm your host, Carl Reineman. Please like and share our podcast. Tune in and listen for new episodes. And if you haven't listened to some of our others, you can always find us at oneshotathistory.com.